everyone. I'm Toni Schafer, and this is Tara Black, and we are ministry leaders at Higher Ground. We're coming to you today to continue a conversation that Tony Phillips, our senior pastor, and I started last week. The conversation was on racism. It's nobody's favorite subject, but it's super important, and it's vital that we continue this conversation. And Tara and I are coming here today as white voices, mostly talking to other white voices. So we're going to recap what we talked about last week and move forward. So there's three big things we talked about last week. The first one was white supremacy. White supremacy is an ideal that our nation was founded on. It's the idea that we as white people are central to humanity, that we are the image of God, and that every other race is tangential, is pathological, is other than. White supremacy says we don't have to deal with issues of race. All right, good. We also talked about racial socialization. Racial socialization means that we are all involved in a racist society. It means that no matter where we grew up, how progressive a household we live in, or how many black friends we have, we all are a part of a racist society. We've been fed racist ideas, and most of the time we're participating in racist systems without our knowledge. Racial socialization. We also talked about something called binary thinking. It's a super dangerous thing where we have a false idea that our options are one thing or the other. It's generally never the case. We have generally a broad array of options, but binary thinking is what keeps us tied to the idea that God and church are the same thing. And it generally is the reason why people will blindly follow policies of the church that are racist. Which brings us to our topic today, racist church policies. So Tara, welcome to the conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Everyone's favorite conversation, racist church policies. It's really hard to talk about. Let's talk about why it's so hard to talk about first.
Well, I guess part of the reason why it's hard to talk about is because, like you're saying, with binary thinking, people just come under the assumption that churches are always in the right and always doing the right thing. And so, as we know from history, that isn't always the case. While sometimes churches are explicit in their bad policies or racist policies, a lot of times they're just very implicit. And so they're just perpetuating systems or creating kind of a country club for certain types of people. They're not integrating what society actually looks like into their buildings. And so I think we could start with some of the history of why and how maybe this got started in at least America. We're going to at least talk about America today.
Right.
And go through to how it's still happening and what we need to do to fix this.
Yes. Well, I like to take it way farther back than America. So racist church policies started as far back as the 3rd century. The 3rd century is when the church was brand new. Christians were thoroughly persecuted. I mean, church was brand new. It was very subversive. It was countercultural. It was still small. And the Roman Empire was largely pagan, and they were basically out to kill some Christians. So a bishop in Caesarea decided he was going to write a series of books about Constantine, who was a Roman Empire at the time that was consolidating power. The bishop, whose name was Eusebius, decided it was a great idea if he tied Constantine and Christianity together. Because as Constantine was gathering power and consolidating the Roman Empire, if he could just become Christian, the Roman Empire would become Christian. And so it did. And in that one moment, as Constantine dubbed the Roman Empire, now the Holy Roman Empire, the church went from becoming something that was subversive and countercultural and about repentance and community and about persecution to being about allegiance to an oppressive regime. It was really a bad move on the church's part.
For sure.
So that was kind of a big one. Kind of a big one. 700 years later, they took it a step further. And they wanted to push this ideal that Christianity was the top of the heap when it comes to religions, that no other religion could stand on the face of this earth. So the Crusades began. Now the Crusades were incredibly complicated, lots of different parties in play there. It's a very complicated situation, generally is in the Middle East, but the Crusades spread some dysfunctional theology through Europe and Asia, basically saying that Christians could conquer any Muslim land. They called them Saracens at the time. They could conquer any Muslim people and land and take all their stuff, and that stuff became property of the Holy Roman Empire. And we got rich, which is really something that a church shouldn't be super excited about doing.
Yeah.
400 years after that, we decided to take it global. So Pope Nicholas writes a papal bull. Papal bull is like a paper that a pope writes, and it's called Dom Diversas, and it is giving the King of Portugal carte blanche to take his discoverers, or take his dudes across the Atlantic, take any lands that he finds, conquer and destroy any non-Christians he runs into, and it's cool that he takes a detour into Africa and can enslave any people that he finds there to go with him to build and establish a nation on the Americas. And all this was done as God's will. If anyone was to question any of this, they were questioning God's will, they were going against God and the church, and most likely they would be killed. So all this stuff kind of tells us that we cannot measure something against what the church happens to say is right at the moment. Because the church isn't always in line with morality and ethics. Sometimes we have to follow what our faith and our heart is telling us, because I can't imagine that everyone who heard all that was happening at these times felt in their heart that this was actually the right thing to move forward the kingdom of God.
Right.
What do you think?
I agree. And I think that especially during the historical period that we're talking about, people weren't necessarily literate and they weren't necessarily educated. And so they really did rely on leaders and church leaders to tell them what the Bible was saying, what leaders were saying. And so they kind of blindly accepted, I think, some of these things without, like you said, they probably felt in their heart, this isn't right, but they didn't have the knowledge to back that up. And we see that even continue through, like to a point today, I would say, where you have leaders who can, really be salesmen for their particular ideas in churches, and they have maybe very vulnerable people in their congregation, and they can really push them to feel like God's will is aligning up with what the pastor is saying and their plans, and the people just they don't know, they don't want to question. And when you have someone who's, maybe a new to the faith, and they don't want to look bad, so they don't want to question anything, and they don't want to say that doesn't feel right or that doesn't sound right. And there's not always space in churches for people to ask questions.
No, there's often not space in churches for people to ask questions. Church generally feels like a place that you come after your questions have been answered, after you're sure of what you think. And that's not what Jesus meant for church to be. Jesus meant for church to be a place where the lost come, and not where someone comes who feels that they have the answers. Church was never meant for people to run and rule. It was meant for people to be. And I think you had a great point. At these points in history that we're talking about, people were highly illiterate, and they did rely on leaders to give them the information or tell them what the Bible was saying or what God was saying. And now that we are widely literate and we have access to an incredible amount of information, the way that we're kind of getting the wrong information or getting told the wrong stories is by the incredible whitewashing of our history. And that's what's happening currently in America, that we're learning American history, we're learning our church histories in an incredibly watered down, whitewashed way, through the lens of white supremacy that makes us as white people comfortable, and that completely does not acknowledge the pain of people of color that created and had a part in that history.
It's like that saying, like, history is told by the conquerors. And so
Yes.
you're getting one version from the people who essentially won the battle, and all of the other voices and all those other experiences are just, they're being left out, and it's not telling the complete story.
Right. And that's one of the reasons why we as white people have a hard time talking about racism and race, because we've learned history through the lens of white people, through the lens of the white victor. So we feel like that's everyone's experience. Everyone must have experienced history in that way. And when someone comes to us and says, we did not experience history in that way, we've been traumatized by that history that you're celebrating, we can't possibly imagine how, because we did not learn it that way. And it's our job to learn history as it happened, not just how we learned it in high school, but as it actually happened, because we have access to that information now. We have no reason to be ignorant anymore. I think a really good example, and this is unfortunate, we're not here to attack or be divisive or be mean, but we do want to speak truth to power. And a great example of the whitewashing of history is the history of the church right next door, McEachern Memorial. McEachern tells their church history in a way that shows a family rolling a wagon from North Carolina to Georgia in early 1800s after a survey of Cherokee lands. They never mention that 2 years prior to this survey of Cherokee lands, Thomas Jefferson forcibly removed 4,000 to 6,000 Cherokee peoples in what we know as the Trail of Tears. When we leave that piece out, we don't acknowledge the pain of the First Nations people that our history caused. We're telling those people that our history makes us proud, and if it caused them trauma, that doesn't affect us. That's what we're saying. There's some other
Oh, for
some
sure.
other things in there too.
And I think to what you're saying is it's like that manifest destiny mentality
Mhm.
that, if you are white and you're Christian, things just belong to you
Yes.
from God's will. And so that gets to be a very interesting dynamic talking about church histories, especially on lands that belonged to Native Americans, because you know, it's presented as a story that's that hardworking American family that went to the open frontier. Like, that's as American history as you get.
Mhm.
But it's leaving out the church's, I guess and this could be even really implicit and explicit, it's both, of fulfilling a manifest destiny mentality. And that's dangerous. It's dangerous to have that mindset in order to think conversion, or in order to think reaching people with a gospel is going to work if you're taking their home from them. Those don't really line up.
Right. I mean, how do we preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to those people? How is it good news for those people? And if it's not good news for everyone, then it's not really good news.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
What are some other ways that we are finding that McEachern history is kind of leaving some things out?
And I think a big thing that we've noticed is some of the wording.
Yes, the language. Yes.
Language is important, and so there's some things here about wars between the states, instead of saying the Civil War, or saying the federal government burned something, instead of saying Union troops came into the area to
When the war ended.
right. So wording is very important, because I think it really waters down the historical context of what was going on at this time, to just kind of, okay, that was burned, we don't have records, let's move on to the next part of this story. And we're not acknowledging what part did McEachern play in the Civil War? What part did they play before, after, with Reconstruction? Where's that history? That history is totally missing.
It's really hard to find. It's really hard to find. I mean, I can do a deep dive. Google knows me well, and it's really hard to find any information about who built our first church and what happened when the church split between Free Methodist and Methodist Episcopal South, and why we were affiliated with Methodist Episcopal South.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of you who are not familiar, in 1845, the Methodist Church split over the issue of slavery, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, our church was supported by the Methodist Episcopal South, which was in favor of slavery. And we're not here to, smack the hands of our ancestors and say, how dare you racists. It's not about that. It's about acknowledging the other people in the story. No one's saying, these people are terrible and their names shouldn't be on the buildings. They did what they did. They built the buildings, and we all, I guess, have to be okay with that and how it happened. But why? Hates us. But not telling the whole story means that the other people in the story are forever and in perpetuity disrespected. So when we say things like, we want our church to reflect our community, we want our church to look like that school, we want our church to look like, what it looks like across the street, it's not going to happen when we actively disrespect the history of their ancestors and celebrate and revere the history of ours only.
For sure. Yes. And yeah, I just think it brings up it's just a complicated issue, but that doesn't mean it's not worth talking about.
No.
That doesn't mean we can't do better now. Because we have, all of these things are coming to light now, and then you read whitewashed history, and I think it's okay for us to say we're not okay with leaving out so many parts of the story. And the fact that even with Google, it is hard to find this information, that really does say something about it being so white and Eurocentric. And it's very hard, like you were saying, to match your community if you have that history, but that's the only history you're saying, because that's not welcoming to people.
No.
At all. And this community is a community that's pretty diverse, and we need to reflect that as the church. Like, our church should be a microcosm of the outside society, and that's not what's happening.
Not at all. I mean, if you know what our community looks like, and you know what McEachern Methodist looks like, it is not a reflection of the community. And I'm not always convinced that that is the goal.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not always convinced that that's the goal, and that might be the issue, that we as white people hold on to what's ours. Mm-hmm. We see that our ancestors built this, and it's been ours, and it was endowed to us, and why should we give it up?
Yeah, I think there's a sense that you push a pride through what happened, but because that's only half of the story, you don't, I don't know, it's kind of like you don't need to owe the past to be a change in the present. You don't need to do that. And so going forward, you're right, it needs to be very, very planned out to make sure that we are reaching, and not just reaching the community. You can have a white savior complex all day long and say, we're going to feed this person or fix that car, and those things are great. They really are. But in order for someone to be part of your community, they need to be part of your life. You need to be part of their life. You need to have relationships.
Yeah.
And that's not happening when you're doing it with a 10-foot pole, reaching out just to feel good about what you're doing. And we can't do that. We can't do that. We need to break down all of those barriers and say, this is what our community looks like, this is what our church should look like. And people who aren't part of this history need to have voices and representation and roles in leadership, because there's no way, if we keep saying, this is our history, this is what our church looks like, and we don't give anyone voices, that we can honestly do what's best for people who are not white.
No, we'll never be able to serve a community that we never intended to serve. That's just the way it is. It's the idea of systemic racism in general. If we don't fix the system, if we don't fix the macro environment, fixing the little micro environments are putting a Band-Aid on a cough.
Right.
To say that we have such pride in our missions, and we take our faith and our money and take them to needy areas of the world, and even our local missions, to say that we take that money out into the world, but we are so reluctant to invite that world into our community seems incredibly hypocritical. It seems incredibly anti-Christian. Jesus was the ultimate subversive. Jesus hung out in the gutter. Jesus would not be hanging out in a lily white country club. And I think we lost that. We lost that in the 3rd century when we became the Holy Roman Empire. We lost that when we thought of something called a Christian nation. Jesus never intended for the kingdom to be a worldly kingdom. We were never meant to put borders around our kingdom and keep people out. Jesus came so that it could be for everyone. And when we put barriers around it, we turn the good news into ideology. We do everything that people who are hating and persecuting Christians are saying. We become exactly what they say we are. And for me, I'm tired of being represented like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want people to look at me and see that. I love being a Christian. I love saying that I love Jesus. But it's really hard to separate because of binary thinking.
Mm-hmm.
There's binary thinking on both sides. Some people will see white Christians and be like, they're not going to like me if I'm a person of color, or they're going to discriminate against me. So these are the conversations that we need to be having. And telling our history is a vital piece of that. And telling our present is a vital piece of that. And that means saying things that are incredibly uncomfortable. Saying things that when we see racist things happening, we have to say them. When we see our friends of color that we know get paid less than their white peers, we have to say that. And we have to say that we don't understand why that's happening.
Yes. It's true. It's very true. And I think for a while, it's like that saying, like, politics and religion stay off the Thanksgiving table. And in a way, that's actually really created this space where it's very uncomfortable to talk about real issues.
Yeah.
And so these are real things that are really happening. And the thing that I always tell people and recommend is you need to get to know people who do not look like you. You need to get into communities that do not look like yours. And you need to listen, but better yet, you need to believe the stories of what people are saying.
Absolutely. Yes. That was one of the things that Toni and I were talking about. That as white people, the most important thing we can do is believe people of color.
Yes.
If a person of color tells you that something is racist, it's racist.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the groups that we talked about today, First Nations people, Native Americans, American Indians, we do not have a lot of interaction with these groups.
Mm-hmm.
Every white person in Georgia will tell you they're 164th Cherokee,
Yes.
but none of them belong to a First Nations tribe.
Yes.
It's very hard to empathize with that group. So when somebody tells you that your beloved Atlanta Braves tomahawk chop is racist, you have to believe them, because it is. And just because you're comfortable with that, and just because it's part of your story and part of your history and heritage, doesn't mean that it's not racist. And that doesn't make you a horrible person. And that doesn't mean that everything else you've done in your life isn't good, and that you're not a good Christian or father or mother or brother or sister. But that is racist.
That's the binary thinking, though. To think that if you take part in something that's racist, you're automatically offended and thinking, what does this say about myself?
Yeah.
But that's just binary thinking, because the point is that we are all part of systems and we all perpetuate things that are cultural to a point that we really might not think about the implications.
Mm-hmm.
And so to know something's part of your history, but you're not that history, you are not that situation, person, whatever.
Right.
Break that binary thinking and realize, be mature in your thinking to realize that you can be separate. That if someone says that's racist, that's white privilege, that's whatever, it's not a personal attack on you. And if you feel that way, there's probably some deep work that needs to happen, because if you're going to be honest, when you're called out about something and it makes you uncomfortable, there's something going on. And so we need to work on that. We need to be able to not just point and shout and say, you're a racist, you're white privilege, your stories aren't true, or you're this or you're that, and say, let's have a conversation and let's hear the stories, let's believe the stories, let's get input from the people that this is happening to. What can we do to move forward that would work for you? because that's what we're not doing.
No.
We're band-aiding it to say, this happened, but it's history. Don't erase history. Or this happened, and we need to do X, Y, Z without getting input from the people who are actually affected by these things.
We want to keep ourselves most comfortable.
Yes.
And that's doing everything through that lens of white supremacy. Because we want to do everything to keep ourselves most comfortable and put that Band-Aid, over what we've been doing.
And that's very not Jesus' message. To
No.
say, hey, let's go to a disenfranchised group of people, but still keep our lives very comfortable. Because
Exactly.
that's not how this works.
Right. And if we're not willing to meet people of color, across the table, if we're not willing to reach across the table, then it's not worth having a conversation. It's not worth saying these performative
Right.
things like I'm colorblind and putting Black Lives Matter signs in your yard. That performative anti-racism is not necessary. What Tara was saying is absolutely right, and that's the heart of Christianity. It's so much less important than what you're putting on your social media than it is to have a relationship with a person that doesn't look like you. Know someone who doesn't live, look, or love like you do. Once you know someone that doesn't look like you, once that person is a human being to you, you are going to have such a hard time supporting a policy that oppresses and hurts that person. And that relationship, that idea of relationships and our religion living in that love between human beings, that's Christianity.
Definitely.
That's church.
And when you say be the hands and feet of Christ, the hands and feet of Christ aren't just feeding people. The hands and feet of Christ are knowing people and transforming them, because your relationships and your love shows them something greater than what the world has. Because we are not to be conformed to the world. And I think a lot of people take that as, don't fall into a pop culture trap, don't listen to this music or don't wear those pants. But that's so superficial.
Yeah.
The world sets us up to us versus them, to have enemies, to draw lines, to draw borders. And those are the things we need to do to be not of this world. We need to be open, armed, open,
Yes.
bordered, open, loved, open to everything, because that is truly how you're going to reach people for Jesus. Jesus was not this guy that was like, put up a fence and I'm just going to be like the king. He did the
No.
opposite of that on purpose.
Yeah.
That was on purpose.
Radical.
Absolutely radical.
Radical. And Jesus was the best example of how we were never meant to have this Christian nation. If Jesus wanted to, he absolutely could have schmoozed Pilate and been in with the Roman elite. Absolutely. Pontius Pilate was looking to have that happen. Please tell me something so I don't have to crucify you. He was looking for that. It was never about that. Jesus was a radical. He opened his arms to everyone, especially when the church didn't. So is there anything else you wanted to say? Is there anything else we forgot today?
I'm not so sure. I feel like we had a wide variety of things, and I feel like this is a conversation that could go on for days, to be honest with you. So I just think one thing is that everybody right now, given the climate that we have, especially Christians, need to just stop and really think about the implicit and explicit ways that you might be perpetuating systems that are hurting people in our communities, in our country, in our world. I mean, this just keeps growing. And so let's be very introspective without binary thinking and say, how can we move forward? And I know you're very big on education and books, and so there's so many things out there.
Yeah.
And I mean, we could put some lists in the comments of books or something that could be very helpful for people. But what about you? Anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I mean, we talked at the end of last week about directional thinking and how we don't need our binaries anymore. It's not just good or bad. You're not just, I'm not a racist so that everything exempts me. We're talking about directional thinking. If you've done things or supported things in the past that you found out are racist, all you are required to do is acknowledge the hurt and move forward. We call that growth. It's a beautiful thing. We've all done it. We're all trying to do it, and it's happening every day. That growth is making the kingdom better, and it's making us all better. So let's keep doing that.
Yes.
Let's keep growing, and let's keep having this conversation.
Sure.
So, everyone, thank you for joining us for this conversation. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, friend us on Facebook,
Yes.
and follow us on Instagram at Seek Higher Ground. It's been great. Thank you.
I'm so glad I had my backup.